The sun in the Arizona Territory was a fist of brass in the year 1888, clenching down on the Mogollon Rim. It was the dry season, the kind that cracked the earth into 1,000 desperate mouths and left the air tasting of pulverized grit and bitter yucca. Dust was not a condition here. It was a permanent resident, coating everything from the high dark pines far off on the rim down to the low, stubborn saguaro cactus that dotted the flats. Saguaro Bend was less a town and more a stubborn smudge of human habitation clinging to the edge of the arid plains. It existed because of two things: the sprawling cattle ranches that needed supplies, and the new, screeching railway line that promised to connect this harsh corner to the civilized East, a promise that felt less like salvation and more like a warning. Wyatt Cole's ranch, the Cole Ranch, was about 3 hours' ride east of the town. It was bordered by a perpetually dry riverbed, a meandering scar of baked clay, and low-lying scrub brush. Wyatt, at 32, carried the quiet gravity of a man who had been the last line of defense against flood, drought, and rustlers since he was a boy. He wasn't a talker, he was a doer. His favorite retreat when the weight of the ranch debt or the unending drought pressed in was the bench outside the tack room, where he would methodically repair old saddles and stitch new leather onto worn bridles. The work was simple, measured, and it gave him a feeling of control the weather and the market never would. His goal was simple: to keep the ranch solvent and build a house, not just walls and a roof, but a place where someone might be waiting. The center of Saguaro Bend was a collection of buildings that looked ready to pack up and leave on the next gust of wind. The Silver Spur Saloon, with its perpetually swinging doors and the low, off-key plink of a piano, sat opposite the sheriff's office. There was a rough wooden church, a bustling stagecoach depot, and the combined post office and telegraph office, the last a crucial hub of both news and rumor in the territory. It was here, at the depot, just past noon on a day where the sun bleached the sky white, that Maggie Hart stepped off the northbound stage. At 27, Maggie was sharp-edged and compact. Her traveling suit was plain but well-made, designed for practicality, not pretense. She carried a single, stout trunk and a smaller, heavily used leather satchel that smelled faintly of antiseptic and dried herbs, her medical kit. Maggie was known, in the vague, rumor-fueled way of the frontier, as a woman of varied pasts, a saloon singer in Wichita, a seasonal midwife in dusty, forgotten mining camps, and always a woman who moved on. Her current reputation, a whisper carried by the railroad hands, was that she was hard to love, too smart, too self-sufficient, and too brutally honest to make the necessary compromises that kept a woman soft and married in this age. Her immediate goal was as practical as her boots secure work: earn enough hard currency to get the heck out of the Arizona borderlands, and start over somewhere quiet, where no one knew her name or her past mistakes. That past was a tight, silent wound: the fear of commitment, the memory of being promised a future, only to be abandoned by a charming Kansas swindler. He had left her with a mountain of his debt and a reputation scorched by gossip. She wouldn't be fooled by sweet talk or grand plans again. As she stretched her legs on the dusty wooden boardwalk, taking in the heat and the sight of the low mountains, the underlying social tension of Saguaro Bend was about to boil over. The town, like many in the region, was being squeezed by Silas Crane. Crane was officially a prosperous merchant, dealing in hay and equipment, but everyone knew his true trade lay in rustling, taking cattle from smaller, struggling ranchers. Crane worked hand in glove with banker Harlan, who was expertly using manipulated debt to tighten the noose on local homesteaders. Sheriff Ebb Miles, a decent but weary man, knew what was happening but was paralyzed. His son, a reckless young man, had fallen into a serious debt of his own to Crane, leaving Ebb with little leverage to enforce the law honestly. The air was heavy, not just with heat, but with this unspoken fear. Maggie was signing for her trunk when the air split with the sound of a gunshot. It wasn't a duel, just the casual violence of the frontier. A ranch hand, fortified by cheap whiskey from the Silver Spur. Decided his anger at the heat and the banker Harlan required expression. He staggered into the street, pulled a worn pistol, and fired 3 wild shots toward the sky, one of which ricocheted harmlessly off the galvanized roof of the telegraph office. Panic was instant and chaotic. People scattered, diving behind water barrels and feed sacks. Maggie froze, her brain processing the danger too slowly. Before she could move, a shape materialized out of the dust cloud kicked up by a bolting pack horse. A large hand clamped around her forearm, firm and ungentle, hauling her sideways with a decisive grunt of effort. "Get down, Miss—" a low, gravelly voice commanded. The force of the pull sent her tumbling. They landed hard behind a stack of railway ties, the impact jarring the breath from her lungs. She ended up pressed against a large, solid mass of working man, smelling strongly of sweat, worn leather, and the clean, earthy scent of a man who spent his life outdoors. The man had shielded her completely. The silence that followed was broken only by the whimpering of a child and the sound of the drunk man being roughly subdued. Maggie pushed herself upright, running a hand over her surprisingly intact hat. The dust had found its way everywhere, coating her face and her nice traveling suit in a fine, red layer. She glared at her rescuer, a man who loomed over her even while crouched. Wyatt Cole. He was ruggedly handsome in the way granite is handsome, all sharp planes and unyielding strength. His eyes, the color of faded denim, were assessing the street, not her. "Well," Maggie said, brushing dust from her skirt with sharp, annoyed movements. "You drag a person like that in the East, you'd be looking at a lawsuit." Wyatt turned his head, his gaze finally settling on her, unblinking. A slow, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the kind of expression that said he hadn't heard an unnecessary word in a decade. "The East has laws," he drawled, his voice a low, steady rumble. "This country has dust." Maggie felt a reluctant, faint twitch of amusement. His answer was brutally simple, direct and completely accurate. Here, the immediate priority was survival, not decorum. The unexpected proximity, the lingering warmth where his body had pressed against hers. The faint scent of horse sweat and leather was a dangerous distraction. "My trunk is still by the post office," she stated, standing up, determined to regain her composure and her space. "I take it the gunfire is a standard afternoon greeting. Only when the cattle are late or the well is dry," Wyatt replied, standing as well. He was taller than she expected, and carried himself with an innate confidence that wasn't arrogance, but sheer capability. He didn't offer help, he simply observed. Sheriff Miles was dragging the offender towards his office. Wyatt, taking a moment to look at Maggie's leather satchel, noticed the neat stitching and the tools peeking out. "That's a proper doctor's bag, or close to it," he noted, nodding toward the kit. "Midwife and seasonal nurse, when I can find the work," Maggie clarified, retrieving her belongings with a practiced ease. "I can set a bone, stitch a cut, and handle most things short of the Spanish flu." The immediate, practical need of the moment shifted Wyatt's expression from taciturn observer to calculated businessman. He frowned, running a thumb over the worn edge of his belt buckle, a familiar nervous tick. "I don't need a doctor, miss. I need a miracle. But I'd settle for a bookkeeper who can cook," he admitted, cutting straight to the core issue. "I'm Wyatt Cole. My foreman's wife left last month with the ranch cook. I'm short-handed going into the fall cattle drive. I need someone who can keep track of stores, handle the accounts before Harlan and Crane eat us alive, and keep the hands fed and patched up." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, trying to read her, the woman with the elegant hands who carried a bag of medical tools. "It's hard work, no time for singing, and it's not permanent." This was the solution she hadn't dared hope for. Immediate shelter. A good wage Wyatt Cole looked too proud to pay poorly, and the anonymity of a working ranch outside of the gossipy town. "Maggie Hart," she responded, meeting his gaze levelly. My terms are a full board wage, an hour of undisturbed rest daily, and private quarters, preferably away from the cookhouse chatter. She wanted walls, quiet, and no easy way for people to drop by and talk. I've got a small room over the shed near the kitchen, Wyatt offered. It's got a window facing the desert. Quiet. No one goes up there but me for storage. You'll be your own island. And the work. Heavy on the books, heavy on the cooking, heavy on the chores, Wyatt said. The hands get clumsy with knives and horses. We need a steady hand for accounts and injuries. And I need a cook who doesn't burn everything to coal. My cooking is passable, Maggie admitted dryly. But my bookkeeping is excellent, and I never leave a cut without a clean stitch. She looked out across the dry, sun-baked landscape. The coal ranch was a precarious position, a good man, debt, and the vultures circling. The whole situation felt like a metaphor for her own life, a constant battle against forces trying to break you, and the fragile hope of building something lasting, even if just for a season. Done, Maggie said, extending a gloved hand. Wyatt took it. His grip was broad, rough, and surprisingly firm. The handshake was a simple, sincere agreement between two individuals who understood the language of necessity better than the language of romance. Good, Wyatt said, releasing her hand. The offer is for a temporary stay. Miss Hart, you work, you stay, you save your money. And when the spring cattle are sold, you go. I get a house that runs for a season, and a solid accountant. A temporary contract, Maggie repeated, the words feeling like armor. No ties, no expectations, no promises to break. That was the only kind of relationship she could accept. As they walked back toward the stage to collect her belongings, Maggie noticed a few details that painted the true picture of the man. His jacket had a patch sewn with an unusually intricate, neat stitch. The heel of his boot was freshly resoled. He adjusted a loose post on the boardwalk without breaking stride. He was a man who fixed things. Wyatt helped load her trunk onto his buckboard. As the wagon pulled away from Saguaro Bend, the silver spur, the sheriff's office, and the telegraph office faded into the swirling red dust. Maggie felt the familiar, weary relief of movement. She was putting distance between herself and the town's rumors, heading into the quiet anonymity of the ranch. She glanced at the coal ranch as it came into view, a low, rambling cluster of buildings centered around a sturdy, two-story wooden house. It looked solid, if weathered. But as they approached, she noticed a section of the barbed wire fence near the corral. It was leaning heavily. 2 posts snapped, the boundary line sagging pathetically toward the dust. A broken fence, a fragile boundary. Wyatt followed her gaze. Rustlers. They cut it a few nights back to spook a heifer. I haven't had the time to fix it right, he explained, his jaw tightening. The broken fence symbolized more than just a damaged boundary. It was a physical sign of the vulnerability of the entire operation, the thin line between order and the lawlessness that Silas Crane represented. They settled her into the small room above the outbuilding. It was Spartan, a thin mattress, a wash basin, and a wooden shelf, but it had a sturdy latch and the desert window Wyatt promised. On the small wooden desk sat a kerosene lamp. Maggie touched the glass chimney. It was a small, fragile light in the overwhelming expanse of dust and darkness. Wyatt left her with a tin cup, a sturdy, scratched piece of utilitarian metal. Water from the cistern, coffee in the morning, he instructed. The tin cup, warm and practical, felt more honest than any silver tea service. Mr. Cole, Maggie called as he started down the outside stairs. He stopped, looking back. I don't need a chaperone. I don't need sermons. And I won't suffer any man's attempt to rescue me, she stated, her voice quiet but firm. I'm here to work, and then I'm gone. Wyatt paused for a long moment, one hand resting on the smooth, worn wood of the railing. Miss Hart, he finally replied, not with anger, but with an odd, measured curiosity. Around here, everyone's running from something, and everyone needs help, Even if they won't say it, don't worry about me trying to rescue you. I'm just trying to keep my own head above the water." His words didn't try to break through her armor. They simply acknowledged it, making him perhaps the safest man she had met in years. Later that evening, as the dry, howling day gave way to the sharp, clear cold of the desert night, Maggie lit the kerosene lamp. The small, yellow flame was swallowed almost immediately by the vast darkness outside her window. But inside, it was a pool of warmth. She unpacked her bag, her account ledger, a neat stack of bills, a small Bible, and tucked deep inside, a handful of dried yucca flowers, a reminder of a simpler, less complicated time. Beneath these things, she found a picture, the smooth-talking swindler from Kansas, his smile too easy, his promises too large. She tore the photograph in half, dropping the pieces into the wash basin. The past was paid for, now she had to focus on the immediate. Downstairs, Maggie could hear the metallic squeak of a stool and the steady thump of leather being stretched. Wyatt Cole was at his bench, mending a bridle, finding solace in the predictable rhythm of repair. Maggie looked at the broken fence line again in her mind's eye. It was a clear challenge. Boundaries exist to be respected, but sometimes, to survive, you had to learn how to fix the brakes. Too, she was a horse that had been ridden hard and run wild. Wyatt Cole was a rancher who knew how to use a rope. The contract was set, but she had a distinct, uneasy feeling that the temporary arrangement had just become more complicated than either of them intended. She picked up the account ledger, the faint scent of leather from her medical bag mixing with the kerosene. The work was her temporary salvation. She would keep her head down, keep her hands busy, and keep her heart locked tight. The problem, as she would soon learn, was that the West didn't care about your careful plans. It threw danger and connection at you with equal, unyielding force, and a man like Wyatt Cole didn't need grand gestures. He simply needed a problem to fix, and he was staring at a ranch full of them, starting with a fiercely independent woman who claimed she was a problem no one could solve. The arrangement at Cole Ranch quickly settled into the sharp routine of necessity. Maggie was precise. She took her meals in the kitchen but retreated immediately to her small room above the shed, maintaining the distance she required. Her work was multifaceted, calculating the cost of feed against the yield of milk, taking inventory of the winter supplies, and, more critically, keeping a meticulous record of every head of cattle, every purchase, and every potential expenditure. Wyatt had offered a generous wage, paid weekly, and Maggie treated the books like a fortress, ensuring every copper penny was accounted for. Wyatt's initial proposal for her role, seasonal housekeeper and secretary, covered only half of it. Maggie was a force multiplier. When the ranch hand, Jesse, got a nasty gash from a barbed wire fence during a roundup attempt, Maggie cleaned the wound with meticulous care, stitching it closed with the swift, practiced hands of a woman who understood the raw fragility of flesh. She mixed cattle feed with necessary minerals and treated the occasional case of hoof rot with uncomplaining competence. One afternoon, Wyatt found her in the tack room, not with a ledger, but with a small, specialized needle and thread, repairing a saddle cinch that had frayed. He watched her for a moment, appreciating the efficiency of her movements. "I thought you were busy balancing the receipts from Saguaro Bend," he commented, leaning against the doorframe. Maggie did not look up. "The receipts balance. They also show we pay too much for flour, and the local store is charging a tax on credit that isn't legal. I'll address it when I go into town." Wyatt crossed his arms. "You planning on suing the whole territory, Miss Hart?" Maggie finally raised her gaze, her eyes direct and cool. "No, I'm planning on getting back the 20 cents they overcharged, because 20 cents is 20 cents, and they are doing it to everyone. You pay me to be thorough. Mr. Cole." He nodded slowly, a ghost of that first smirk returning. "Thorough is good, but tell me something. Do you think you belong more at the ledger desk or in the saddle?" She returned to her stitching. "Both, but the ledger desk rarely leaves a bruise." "Why?" Just trying to figure out which woman I hired. You seem too handy for a bookkeeper, and too sharp for a cook. I'm both. As the pay stub will attest, we had a deal. Mr. Cole, I handle the work. You stay out of my way, Maggie reminded him, the simple statement drawing a clear boundary. Their daily interactions were a measured dance around practicalities, punctuated by dry wit. Wyatt would drop off a problem, a confusing bill, a lame calf, a shortage of coffee, and Maggie would solve it with calm efficiency. The first major fracture in the Cole Ranch's hard-won equilibrium arrived not on horseback, but through the wires. It was a Monday morning. A few weeks after Maggie's arrival, Wyatt rode in from the North Fields, dust-caked and weary. He was already tense from the ongoing drought and the persistent worry about rustling. But the telegram he had collected from the town was worse than a lost steer. He found Maggie in the kitchen, carefully measuring rations of dried beans into sacks for the ranch hand's next long patrol. "This arrived from Santa Fe," Wyatt said, his voice flat. He slapped the thin paper onto the wooden counter. The telegram, addressed to the Saguaro Bend Sheriff's Office, stated that a large, unregistered herd of cattle bearing fraudulent trail markings, the exact kind of ghost branding used by rustlers, was spotted far north near the railhead. The telegram claimed the shipment had been authorized and signed for release under the name M. Hart. Maggie's hands froze over the beans. She didn't have to look at the paper to feel the cold dread of her past catching up. "It's a forgery," she stated instantly, moving to the counter and looking at the smeared, hurried handwriting. The crude signature beneath the authorization stamp was a clumsy imitation, but the initials were clear. "I know your hand is better than this," Wyatt admitted, though his eyes were clouded with doubt and the sheer weight of the possible consequences. "But the authorities in Santa Fe won't know that. They know a name, and your name just signed off on a fraudulent cattle delivery, which is the exact kind of thing Silas Crane would arrange." The news spread through Saguaro Bend like a brush fire. M. Hart, Maggie Hart, the woman who had suddenly appeared on Cole Ranch, working for the one rancher Crane wanted to break. Whispers turned to outright speculation. "The saloon singer is back in her old business running numbers and shady deals. She's too clever by half, the kind of woman who makes a good rancher bankrupt." The talk was fueled by Silas Crane's network of small, indebted merchants and, most venomously, by the landlady of the town boarding house, who had always viewed independent women as a plague upon the frontier's fragile morality. Maggie felt a desperate urge to flee, to pack her trunk and vanish, fulfilling her own prophecy that she was trouble-bound to a life of running. The bitter taste of her past mistake, the confidence she had misplaced in Kansas, leading to debt and infamy, was back in her mouth. "I didn't sign that." "Wyatt," she insisted, using his first name for the first time in the face of genuine threat. "I've never been to Santa Fe, and I've never dealt with cattle. Someone is using my name because they knew it was floating around in the territory's rumor mill. And they knew I was here." "I believe you, but the bank won't," Wyatt countered. Already running the scenarios in his mind, Harlan, the banker, would seize upon this instantly to call in Cole's loans, claiming instability and criminality on the property. Maggie stood firm. "Then we clear my name. This is my reputation, and I won't let some back-alley swindler or some puffed-up cattle thief use it to destroy yours." The first indirect confrontation with Crane happened the next evening at the Silver Spur. Wyatt had insisted on taking Maggie into town to face the rumors head-on. As they entered the saloon, the noise level dropped instantly. All eyes turned to the woman who was either a hard-working nurse or a fraudulent accomplice. Silas Crane was exactly the kind of man Maggie had learned to distrust, impeccably dressed in a dark wool suit despite the heat, a diamond pin gleaming on his tie. His hands clean. He carried a veneer of politeness that barely concealed his predatory nature. Crane, holding a glass of amber whiskey, approached their table with a practiced smile. "Mr. Cole and Miss Hart, a pleasure. I was just hearing the unfortunate news from Santa Fe. Such a nasty business. Forgery." "Nastier business when the forger is still walking around free, Mr. Crane," Maggie replied smoothly, her voice calm and steady. Crane chuckled. A low, oily sound. Of course, but perhaps I can offer a simple solution to Miss Hart's current reputation problem. He looked at her, his eyes suddenly hard and calculating, stripping away the polite facade. You have a lovely voice. I hear the Spur could use a proper singer, a professional. If you were singing here every night, the town would soon forget this silly telegraph business. It would show you've returned to your roots and are harmless. A clean slate. Miss Hart, think of it as my way of helping the community. It was an insult wrapped in an offer, a public reminder of her past, and a clear attempt to control her and neutralize her influence over Wyatt's finances. If she agreed, she'd be bound to Crane's saloon, unable to help Wyatt with his accounts, and publicly confirming her saloon singer reputation. Maggie smiled, a sharp, genuine smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Crane, I appreciate your charitable spirit, but I'm currently employed, and frankly, my talents are far more useful balancing a set of books than balancing a ballad. The work pays better. 2. The refusal was icy. Crane's smile vanished. His eyes turned the color of cold steel, and for a split second, Maggie saw the true ruthlessness of the man. Suit yourself, Miss Hart, Crane said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. But in Saguaro Bend, reputations are currency, and currency runs out fast when the bank calls the debt. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the heavy scent of expensive cologne and warning behind him. Wyatt hadn't intervened, but he had stood a step behind Maggie, his presence a silent shield. As Crane left, Wyatt spoke, his voice low enough only for her to hear. He offered you a chance to run back to what you know. He offered me a chance to doubt you. I'd rather face him with a broken fence than with a liar. Maggie felt a wave of relief and a surprising jolt of warmth. You believe me? Then, I believe in what I see, Wyatt said, glancing around the now silent saloon. Around here, I trust the hands that work the hardest. I don't trust rumors spread by the lazy or the desperate. Your hands haven't stopped moving since you got here. Maggie. His public support was a lifeline, but it immediately doubled the internal conflict twisting inside Maggie. She hated being vulnerable, hated the reliance on another person's trust. Her fear of being tied down, of having her stability dependent on a man's belief, warred with the growing respect she felt for Wyatt's quiet strength and integrity. Meanwhile, Wyatt wrestled with his own anxiety. If he trusted the wrong person, his entire ranch, burdened with debt and targeted by Crane, would fall apart. He had already lost his younger brother to the deceit of rustlers tampering with a dam years ago, which made his hatred for Crane personal and intense. He was a man with a deep-seated allergy to broken promises. And the M. Hart's signature was a promise of trouble, yet Maggie's honesty felt like a solid rock in the middle of a shifting river. The tension on the ranch became a constant, low hum, alleviated only by the sporadic, dry humor they used to bridge the professional gap. Do you think I'm better suited to the ledger or the piano? Maggie asked Wyatt one evening, stirring the pot of stew. Wyatt took a bite of cornbread, considering her question seriously. Both. But the ledger desk is less likely to break a man's heart, and it definitely causes fewer saloon brawls. Maggie laughed, a sound Wyatt realized he hadn't heard before. A rich, honest sound that wiped the exhaustion from his face for a moment. The threat of the false telegram, however, created an urgency. The more Crane tried to discredit Maggie, the more determined Wyatt became. He decided to accelerate the cattle drive, moving the small herd earlier than planned through a dangerous, narrow rock canyon, a risky shortcut, but one that bypassed the major trails where Crane's men were known to wait and intercept. The tension also inadvertently fostered a small side plot of connection. June, the 10-year-old daughter of one of the ranch hands, was a bright, quiet girl, fascinated by Maggie's work. June would often linger outside Maggie's shed, watching her mend blankets or organize her medical supplies. The girl was desperate to learn to read. One evening, Maggie noticed June tracing letters in the dirt with a stick, feeling a rare, unexpected pull toward connection. Maggie began to teach her, secretly. After the workday ended, under the shade of the largest saguaro, Maggie would use her account ledger pages to explain the alphabet and the sounds of words. June's intense focus and quick understanding were a quiet balm to Maggie's soul, planting the seed of the idea that perhaps connection could be forged, not broken. It was a family of choice, a simple mentorship that offered a quiet hope in the dust. The symbolic weight of the telegraph stamp, a small piece of paper from a new technology, represented the modern trap. Technology, the great connector, also allowed dishonesty to travel faster than truth. Reputation, Maggie realized, was the only true currency in the territory, and trust was the only collateral. The result of the fraudulent telegram and Crane's blatant manipulation was clear. Wyatt could not wait. The risk of delay was greater than the risk of the early canyon drive. The next morning, he gathered his men. The air was thick with the scent of leather and anticipation. As Wyatt prepared to ride out to gather the herd, he looked at Maggie standing on the porch, holding his tin coffee cup. "If Crane's men show up while I'm gone, you stay inside the house," he ordered, his eyes grave. "Don't trust anyone." "I only trust what I see and what I can prove," Maggie confirmed. "Bring the herd back safe. Wyatt, I'll make sure the receipts are waiting." Wyatt nodded, his glance lingering on her for a beat too long. He turned, mounted his blue roan, and rode out into the dust, leaving Maggie alone to manage the ranch and to face the growing shadow of Silas Crane, with nothing but her integrity and a ledger. The weeks that followed Wyatt's departure to guide the herd through the treacherous canyon were a demanding lesson in the reality of ranching. It was a life built on constant, physical vigilance. Maggie, operating as the acting steward, found herself immersed in a world far removed from saloon lights and ledger books. Her hands, once adept at piano keys and tiny surgical stitches, quickly adapted to the rugged demands. She learned the quick, necessary actions required to hold a horse steady for shoeing, how to treat a torn tendon, and the precise, measured movements necessary for vaccinating young calves. She didn't merely dispense medicine, she administered care. She mastered the art of measuring out morphine doses that would ease pain without causing stupor and mixing the caustic lime water used to treat infections. The ranch hands, a mixture of weather-beaten veterans and nervous, green youth, began to regard her not as the rumored saloon singer, but as an authority. A woman who commanded respect through demonstrable skill. Her efficiency, however, did not extend to the kitchen. Wyatt returned after a grueling 5-day stretch in the canyon. Dust coating his eyelashes and exhaustion etched around his mouth. He found Maggie, smelling faintly of turpentine and cattle dip, presenting him with a plate of cornmeal bread that had clearly spent a few minutes too long near the fire. The edges were dark, almost charcoal. He sat, pulled off his hat, and took a large, weary bite. "It's charred," Maggie noted, watching him carefully from the opposite side of the table, arms crossed, daring him to complain. Wyatt chewed slowly, savoring the warmth. Regardless of the taste, "No, it's not charred. It's got flavor. Tastes like home." "That's the kind of compliment a man gives when his horse is faster than his wit," Maggie retorted, rolling her eyes. "You praise it like you're trying to mend a fence with pretty words." Wyatt set down the tin cup. "I'm a rancher. Maggie, I don't use pretty words. I call things what they are. This is burned bread, and I'm going to eat every damn piece because it means someone stood here and took the time to make it for me." That small, genuine admission that the simple act of her making bread, even burned, was valued hit Maggie with surprising force. It was a humor that mixed a light, playful sting with an undercurrent of profound sincerity, the signature of their constrained partnership. Yet, despite the easy rhythm of their shared labor, Maggie maintained her internal guard. She started to realize she enjoyed the monotonous security of ranch life, the metallic clang of the cowbell in the morning, the rhythmic creak of the saddle leather, and the solid, familiar sight of Wyatt working under the porch, his back bent over the leather. This routine was predictable. Predictability was safe. But the moment the peaceful domesticity would touch her, she would mentally recite her mantra, "I am hard to love. Do not be foolish enough to trust." Trust had cost her everything once. She was not a woman who made the same mistake twice. Wyatt, too, carried a deep, quiet scar. Maggie noticed that whenever the topic of Silas Crane or his network of rustlers arose, Wyatt's composure would visibly strain. He finally explained it late one night when the drought-stunted moon cast long, skeletal shadows of the yucca plants across the yard. "Crane didn't just start with cattle," Wyatt said, his voice low and gritty. He was, as usual, mending an old bridle, the all punching the leather with disciplined aggression. "Years ago, during a good monsoon, my brother, Daniel, was trying to put a small stone dam up on his claim. Some of Crane's men, they wanted the water to spill into the wrong creek for their own claim. They sabotaged the dam. When the real flood came, Daniel was there trying to fix it. The water took him." Wyatt paused, his eyes fixed on the stitch. "They didn't just break the law, Maggie. They broke a promise the territories promised to be fair, and they took the only family I had left." It was the reason Wyatt's abhorrence of Crane was so absolute. Crane represented the destruction caused by greed and broken trust. It was also why Wyatt struggled with accepting promises himself. He'd seen how quickly they could be swept away. The ranch was currently facing a direct challenge from nature itself. The dry season was turning monstrous. The dust was inescapable. And the cattle, though moved to a safer section of the range, were desperate for water. They had to dig an emergency well, manually. A monumental task in the hard, sun-baked earth. Maggie, unexpectedly, provided the technical solution. She remembered a geological survey map her grandfather, a restless prospector, had once sketched out in Kansas. She led the ranch hands, drawing a diagram in the dirt with her stick. He always said, "Look for the juniper roots." She explained, "They run deep, and where they thrive, there's an ancient riverbed just below the surface. We dig there." Following her guidance, the men struck water a thin, precious trickle, but enough to keep the herd alive for a few more days. Maggie had proved that her intelligence and resourcefulness were not confined to the parlor or the ledger. Despite her rising value, society's judgment was relentless. When Maggie rode into Saguaro Bend for supplies, the landlady of the main boarding house, a woman named Mrs. Peterson, greeted her with an acid glare. "Still at the ranch? Miss Hart seems that kind of hard woman only does harm to a good rancher's reputation. A hard woman makes a hard life, they say." Maggie only nodded curtly. "Then I suppose I'm exactly where I belong. Mrs. Peterson, you have your gossip. I have my work." The prejudice also reached June, the ranch hand's daughter, who was thriving under Maggie's secret tutelage. Maggie found June crying near the cookhouse one afternoon. "The boys in town," June whispered, rubbing the tears and dust from her face. "They called me the book girl. Said I was learning from the bad woman, and that reading would just make me unhappy and hard." Maggie sat down beside her, handing her a clean cloth. "June, reading doesn't make you unhappy. It just lets you know the exact words for why you're unhappy. And that's a powerful thing. And being hard in this country just means you have good boundaries. Keep learning. Don't let their opinions be your story." Maggie's own internal boundaries were tested one night during a midnight perimeter check. She was on duty, circling the nearest pasture, when she noticed strange hoof prints near the north corral, a pattern she didn't recognize, too delicate for a Cole Ranch horse. She followed the prints to the fence line, discovering a carelessly discarded cowboy hat tangled in the scrub brush. It was a standard, dust-covered hat, but Maggie, using the light of her kerosene lantern, noticed something tucked neatly into the lining, a small, embroidered brass badge, the kind Silas Crane wore on his vests, had been subtly stitched into the crown. It was a minimal, almost invisible marker, a calling card of a rustler who thought he was too clever to be caught. It was a small, almost insignificant piece of evidence, easily explained away as a coincidence, but Maggie knew better. It was the whisper of Crane's presence, the cold breath of the man trying to make his claim. She took the hat back to the house, showing Wyatt the finding. Wyatt only looked at the hat, then at Maggie. "You rode out alone to check the line, knowing what's out there?" he asked, his tone demanding an explanation. "The herd is your life, Wyatt. The job is to protect it," Maggie said simply. "Besides, I've seen worse things than a rustler trying to find a hole in your fence." Wyatt took the hat, placing it on a high shelf. He didn't thank her with words. Instead, the next morning, as he prepared for another long ride along the outer boundaries, Maggie approached him with a clean, embroidered handkerchief. It was plain linen, with a simple letter M stitched in blue thread in the corner. "Take this," she instructed, her gaze fixed on the leather strap in his hand. "Use it for the dust, or if you need to stop a cut. Don't lose it." Wyatt tied the handkerchief around the horn of his saddle. It wasn't a public declaration, but the soft linen, carrying the faint, clean scent of Maggie's soap, tied to the rough leather of his working saddle, was a quiet, private message. "Go, and remember to come back." It was a subtle, unspoken loosening of the reins on her heart, a tiny symbol of reliance. The emotional temperature on the ranch was slowly rising, a contrast to the deepening drought. The rhythm was fast during work details of ranch life and labor dominating their speech, but their silences, shared over the dim light of the lantern after a long day, were warmer, growing more comfortable. The new, sturdy fence posts the men had set to replace the broken section stood like silent, physical markers of a growing confidence, a boundary they believed they could now trust. The mounting tension was building toward a breaking point. Just as Wyatt was mapping out the final stages of the drive, a rider from Saguaro Bend delivered a sealed letter. It was from Silas Crane. Crane offered to buy the Cole Ranch's considerable debt from banker Harlan, promising Wyatt a much lower, friendly interest rate. It was a thinly veiled attempt to gain control, making Wyatt indebted directly to the rustler. Wyatt tore the letter in half without reading past the first paragraph. "He calls that friendly?" Maggie asked, watching the paper drift to the dusty ground. "Crane's version of friendship always involves a debt you can never repay," Wyatt said, turning away. "I'd rather ride the canyon alone than owe him a glass of water." But looking up, they both noticed the sky. For the first time in weeks, the brassy white had been replaced by a dense, bruised gray. Black clouds were slowly stacking up behind the jagged peaks of the Mogollon Rim. It was the first sign of the coming monsoon and the threat of the devastating flash flood season, the memory of which had cost Wyatt his brother. The nature that had been their antagonist for months was about to become their explosive enemy. The storm clouds, heavy and silent, did not break in a single, cleansing deluge. Instead, they draped the Mogollon Rim in a promise of chaos that lasted for 2 days, raising the anxiety across Cole Ranch to an unbearable peak. Every ranch hand knew the danger, the sudden, lethal flash flood that could roar down the dry creek beds without warning, the kind that had claimed Wyatt's brother. On the third night, a thin, persistent drizzle finally began, chilling the air but failing to saturate the parched earth. Wyatt and Maggie were outside the main barn, checking the runoff channels, which were still tragically empty. The rain picked up, driven by a biting wind, forcing them to take shelter beneath the wide, sheltering eaves of the main horse stable. The darkness felt protective, muffling the nervous sounds of the horses inside and focusing their world down to the low, even rhythm of the rain drumming on the tin roof. They stood close, not in intimacy, but out of necessity, sharing the small patch of dry ground. "If the rain doesn't come down hard, but keeps this steady drip, the mud will be worse than the dust," Wyatt observed, looking toward the dark, hungry creek bed. "Mud is manageable," Maggie murmured. Looking up at the sky, she felt unusually exposed. both by the proximity and the quiet honesty of the night. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She needed to say it, to reiterate the boundary before the shared work and the shared danger eroded it completely. "Wyatt," she began, her voice barely a whisper against the sound of the rain. She chose her words carefully, feeling the weight of her past. "You're making a tremendous effort here. With the ranch, with the men, with the accounts. You're a builder. Cole, I want you to know what you're dealing with. Though, I told you I was temporary, but I should tell you why I'm temporary." Wyatt was watching her, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat brim. He gave a slight nod, inviting her to continue. Maggie took a deep breath, the air cold and damp in her lungs. "I am hard to love." She didn't say it with pity or self-loathing, but as a simple, objective fact, like stating the earth was dry. "I'm too sharp. I ask for too much space. I don't believe in sweet talk, and I won't be tied down by a promise. I've seen what trusting a man's word costs. It cost me everything in Kansas. I won't do it again. I'm honest about being difficult. Wyatt, save yourself the trouble." The silence that followed stretched thin, broken only by the relentless hiss of the rain. Wyatt didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't turn away. He simply reached up, the action deliberate and slow, and pushed the brim of his hat back off his forehead, revealing his eyes that held a surprising, almost tender intensity. He let a slow, thoughtful smirk crease the corner of his mouth, a gesture that was half challenge and half genuine amusement. "Sweetheart," Wyatt drawled, his voice pitched low, carrying easily over the downpour. "I'm a rancher. I tame wild things." It wasn't a flowery declaration of conquest, or the kind of arrogant boast the Kansas swindler would have made. It was a commitment to patience, a pledge of hard labor. It meant he saw her boundaries and was willing to work around them, to meet her effort with his own, treating her fear not as a flaw, but as a challenge to his skill as a steady hand. He wasn't promising easy love. He was promising persistent effort. Maggie felt the internal walls she had spent years building shudder. She instinctively recoiled from the implication. "I'm not a wild horse." "Wyatt," she warned, trying to maintain the professional distance. "Good," he replied, taking a small step closer, closing the final inch of professional space between them. "Horses kick. They hurt you when you're not expecting it." He lifted his hand, not to touch her, but to gently brush a few drops of rain from the collar of her worn canvas coat. His thumb grazed the rough wool of the fabric, and the momentary contact, the warmth penetrating the cold. Wet cloth felt more honest and revealing than any torrent of words. He leaned in, his movements slow enough to allow her a dozen chances to stop him, but Maggie remained perfectly still, arrested by the sincerity in his gaze. His mouth found hers in a brief, dry press of lips, a kiss that was less about passion and more about marking territory, about acknowledging the magnetic, necessary pull they had been fighting for weeks. It was a simple, woodsy taste of coffee and dust and rain. Wyatt pulled back almost immediately, his breathing steady. "I'll be honest about being me. Too, Maggie, I don't run from hard work, and I don't run from things that need fixing." Maggie could only nod. Suddenly breathless, the moment of intimacy, though brief and contained, had ripped the professional veneer from their arrangement. In the days that followed, a distinct shift occurred. The shared danger and the spoken admission of their mutual, complicated attraction meant they had undeniably chosen sides. They were a we against the world, against the debt, and certainly against Crane. The work continued, but with a different light. Maggie, emboldened by Wyatt's trust and her own need for connection, expanded her secret class. She started gathering not only June but several other children from the neighboring ranch hands' families, holding a small class under the sheltering branches of the largest saguaro cactus in the yard. The ranch children, hungry for knowledge, sat quietly in the dust, learning letters and numbers. The community, at least the working community, began to see Maggie's true value. The fact that she was educating their children and saving them money with her meticulous accounting, not selling dreams on a stage, started to outweigh the rumors from Mrs. Peterson in town. However, Silas Crane was not a man to be defeated by good deeds. He attacked where they were most vulnerable, the bank. A new telegram arrived at the Cole Ranch, addressed directly to Wyatt. It was short and formal, stating that banker Harlan had received a binding purchase agreement signed by Wyatt Cole himself, agreeing to sell off 30% of the herd immediately to cover outstanding debt at a steeply discounted price. The purchaser, of course, was listed as Crane and Associates. Wyatt stared at the forged signature on the copy, his face a mask of cold fury. He's not just using a fake name now. He's faking my signature. He knew I'd be gone, and he's counting on the speed of the wire to seal the deal before I can ride into Saguaro Bend. The new crisis forced Wyatt into a profound internal struggle. He knew Maggie was honest, yet the evidence against them heart from the first telegram, and the constant fear of his ranch being compromised, made him waver. He looked at Maggie, who was analyzing the fraudulent wire with the fierce concentration of a prosecutor. If this goes through, Harlan will seize what's left of the ranch and hand it straight to Crane, Wyatt stated grimly. I can't be everywhere. Maggie, I have to ride to the railhead now and try to intercept the herd before they're marked. I need you to go to Harlan and demand to see the original documents. Stall him. But I can't. I can't afford to trust the wrong person right now. Maggie understood the implicit doubt, the deep-seated fear of betrayal rooted in Daniel's death. He wasn't doubting her character. He was doubting the entire concept of trust itself. Go, Maggie said, placing a hand lightly on his arm, a gesture of quiet support. I won't run, and I won't fail you. If I were a liar, I would have packed up weeks ago when the first telegram arrived. I'm here because I want to fight this. Wyatt, for you, and for my own name. Wyatt looked at her, his eyes searching, assessing the quiet resolve in her face. In that moment, he learned the necessity of delegation. He had always tried to handle everything himself, but here, the battle was twofold, and he needed a partner in the thick of it. He chose to believe her completely, choosing the pain of possible betrayal over the certainty of defeat. All right, he said, his voice husky. You go to Harlan. Tell him I'm coming back with the whole herd, and don't take your eyes off the banker. This act of faith was profound. For Wyatt, who had lost his family because of a broken dam and a false promise, riding away and leaving his last line of defense in the hands of a woman who was a magnet for rumor was perhaps the biggest risk he had ever taken. He was learning to commit not just his labor, but his belief. The deepening bond was symbolized by a small, ongoing struggle in the corral. One of the new young fillies, a beautiful, spirited animal, was proving impossible to break. Every man who approached her was either kicked or thrown. Maggie spent an hour every evening with the filly, talking quietly to her, brushing her coat, and slowly, gently, introducing the weight of the new saddle blanket and the unfamiliar feel of the bit. She worked not with force, but with patience and respect for the animal's need for space. You're gentle with her, Wyatt commented one evening, watching Maggie finally manage to place the light, new saddle on the filly's back without the animal bolting. I understand the fear of a new saddle, Maggie replied, never breaking eye contact with the horse. It means someone is trying to put a rope on you. The saddle isn't the problem. The surprise is, if you introduce the new commitment slowly and let her know she can still run if she needs to, she'll eventually carry the weight. It was an open parallel, a quiet reference to her own heart, which was slowly, warily, allowing the weight of Wyatt's earnest intentions. The filly, now tolerating the saddle, was a symbol of her own heart beginning to permit the unseen bridle of commitment. The pace of their lives sped up in action, but slowed in psychological depth. They had chosen their side. They were committed to the fight, and they were committed to each other, even if only in the unspoken language of shared duty and shelter. The segment concluded abruptly a few days later when a rider arrived from Saguaro Bend with a strange invitation. Silas Crane. In an effort to present a facade of respectability and quiet the rumors of his rustling activities, was throwing a grand business reconciliation party at his newly constructed, massive warehouse outside of town. The invitation was addressed to both Wyatt Cole and Miss Maggie Hart, a clear trap and a public challenge. Crane intended to use the town's respectability and his own wealth to finalize the destruction of Cole Ranch. The warehouse Crane had erected 2 miles outside of Saguaro Bend was a monstrosity of raw lumber and ambition. It was where he stored his legitimate wares hay, feed, and fencing, and where, rumor had it, he laundered the funds from his illicit cattle operations. This night, however, it was draped in the flimsy pretense of civility. Lanterns hung from every beam, their yellow light struggling against the oppressive twilight, casting long, distorted shadows. A 3-piece band sawed merrily at a banjo and a fiddle, and the smell of cheap whiskey mixed with the dry, earthy scent of stored grain. Wyatt and Maggie arrived in the buckboard, both dressed in their finest, which meant clean denim, pressed linen, and boots polished with meticulous care. They entered the warehouse to a wave of nervous silence. Half the townsfolk, dependent on Crane or Harlan, greeted him with exaggerated enthusiasm. The other half, the small ranchers, the struggling homesteaders, the men who lived by the code of the range, offered only strained silence and wary nods. Silas Crane, looking like an undertaker in his tailored black coat, approached them immediately, his smile wide and insincere. "Wyatt, Miss Hart, so pleased you could make it," Crane purred, gliding closer. "A little socialization is good for the soul, and essential for mending fences. Isn't it, especially since some of the accounts have been getting confusing?" "The accounts are perfectly clear, Mr. Crane," Maggie replied, her voice firm. "The confusion is deliberate, not accidental." Crane ignored her, turning his attention entirely to Wyatt, though his eyes kept flickering back to Maggie. "I was just telling Banker Harlan how much I admire the work ethic of your temporary staff. Hard-working woman. That's rare. But speaking of hard work, Miss Hart, I do believe you're tiring yourself out trying to balance those books. A woman of your experience has much more pleasant ways to earn a living. Wouldn't you agree I still recall the stories from the Kansas rail towns? Quite the voice. I hear, quite the reputation." It was the public execution of her honor, delivered with a smile. Crane intended to use the lingering stain of her past to discredit her integrity and, by extension, the financial defense she was building for Wyatt. Wyatt did not rise to the bait with anger. His response was as dry and unyielding as the Arizona landscape itself. "Here, Mr. Crane. Anyone who does honest work earns their keep. I don't care where their past took them. The past is just dust, the horses kicked up and left behind. Miss Hart is at my table because she's honest and she's competent. I haven't seen much of either from your side of the ledger." The exchange was short, brutal, and public. A few people winced, but the silence remained thick with fear. Crane's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but he recovered with a theatrical shrug. "A man's word is his bond, Wyatt, but a woman's reputation is brittle. Keep that in mind when you're dealing with the bank." Maggie, however, had stopped listening. Her eyes were fixed not on Crane, but on a man standing near the edge of the crowd, a lanky, nervous fellow in a dusty suit who was taking notes on a small pad for Crane. This man, she realized, was the cipher, the one who handled the paperwork and the telegrams. He shuffled some papers in his hand, a bundle of official-looking receipts. In that instant, Maggie's gaze locked onto the handwriting on the top receipt, the peculiar slant of the letters, the highly stylized and the way the letter H was looped at the top. It was sickeningly, intimately familiar. It was the same hand that had written the flowery, worthless love letters to her in Kansas 5 years ago. It was the handwriting of the swindler who had left her holding the bag of debt and shame. He hadn't just hired a forger. Crane had hired her past. Maggie felt a cold rush of nausea, followed by a fierce, driving clarity. This wasn't just Crane attacking Wyatt. It was her personal history weaponized against the only real chance at peace she had found. She reached out and took Wyatt's hand under the table, her grip tight and insistent. He turned his head immediately, his gaze sharp and questioning. "I know that man," she whispered, indicating the nervous cipher with the slightest movement of her eyes. "The one by the crates. He's the one who wrote the letters in Kansas. He's a forger, a runner, and a liar. He was the one who promised me everything and left me with nothing but a worthless debt." Wyatt looked at her, his face unreadable in the lantern light. He saw the genuine, raw pain and the fierce, unyielding honesty in her eyes. This was the moment of full disclosure, the laying bare of the scar she carried. She was admitting the full scope of her humiliation, the debt, the infamy, the abandonment. She had laid the last piece of armor down. Maggie waited for the inevitable reaction, the disgust, the retreat, the simple, sensible move away from a damaged woman. But Wyatt did not move. He simply shifted his weight, standing closer to her, his shoulder now slightly brushing hers. "What did he leave you with?" Wyatt asked, his voice low. "A debt I had to work years to pay down, and a reputation that chases me to every town, saying I'm the kind of woman who draws trouble," Maggie confessed, the words tasting like ash. Wyatt's gaze hardened, focusing on Crane across the room, then back to the cipher. "He sold you out, and now he's trying to sell me out using the same handwriting. He's not after you, Maggie. He's after the money, and he's using your shame as a hammer." He did not leave her side. He did not judge her past. He simply accepted the information and incorporated it into the strategy. Maggie felt a warmth that was stronger and more enduring than the heat of the lanterns. This was trust, not as a blind feeling, but as a deliberate choice. The music stuttered to a halt, the banjo player suddenly distracted. The ensuing silence was heavy, punctuated only by the nervous shuffling of feet on the wooden floor, a sound that echoed like a drum roll before a battle. The lanterns, running low on fuel, began to flicker, casting the room into momentary darkness, symbolizing the brief window of choice and truth they were in. Just then, a man walked past their table, bumping the sheriff's office banner hanging loosely from a beam. It was Sheriff Ebb Miles. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting Wyatt's, his face grim with the conflict between duty and fear. Miles didn't speak, but he leaned in close enough to pretend to brush a piece of lint from Wyatt's coat. "Cole," he whispered, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "They're moving. I got a tip. Crane's men. They're planning to hit your herd early. They'll rebrand them with a fresh iron before dawn, using the cover of the heavy clouds." He pulled back, his hand shaking slightly. His debt to Crane, the fear for his son, was crushing him, but he still upheld a sliver of his oath. Wyatt nodded once, a gesture of silent understanding and gratitude. The information was critical. They had anticipated a move, but not this soon. There was no time to ride back and confront the rustlers on the range. Wyatt turned to Maggie. His words were short, clipped, and focused entirely on the immediate reality. "He's going to hit the herd before dawn. We need to move them now. Through the dry riverbed, the shortcut. It's the only way to avoid his main force." "But the clouds," Maggie countered, looking toward the ceiling, where the rumble of thunder was becoming audible, a low growl that spoke of deep mountain moisture. "The risk of flash flood was immense. Risk is the only thing we have left to bargain with," Wyatt decided. They moved immediately. Wyatt gave a brief, quiet instruction to one of his trusted ranch hands who had come with them, telling him to notify the ranch and rally June and the few remaining hired hands. They slipped out of the party and into the cold, damp night. Maggie drove the buckboard like a woman possessed, the lanterns of Crane's false celebration shrinking behind them. When they reached Cole Ranch, the atmosphere was charged with controlled panic. June and two ranch hands, Thomas and Jesse, were already saddling the last of the horses. "June, you stick with Maggie," Wyatt commanded, checking the cinch on his saddle. "Thomas, Jesse, you ride point. We move them fast and quiet. Get them across the dry riverbed before the heavy rain hits the rim." Maggie quickly grabbed her heavy, oilskin coat and her medical satchel. "I'm taking the buckboard across the riverbed first. I can use the light to guide you, and I'll have the morphine and bandages ready for Thomas and Jesse," she declared. "You're not riding alone across the dark," Wyatt argued, his voice harsh with worry. "I'm the fastest, lightest person on the road, and I know how to handle the drop into the creek," Maggie shot back, her logic undeniable. "Besides, if I'm out of the way, you can focus on the herd. Now go." There was no time for further discussion. Wyatt simply nodded, his face etched with grim determination. He reached out and briefly squeezed her shoulder, a quick, hard touch that spoke volumes about his faith in her. The next hour was a blur of action and noise. The lowing of the nervous cattle, the barking of the dogs, the urgent commands shouted in low, strained voices, and the constant, unnerving rumble of thunder growing louder from the mountains. They pushed the small, precious herd through the darkness toward the treacherous, wide stretch of the dry riverbed. Maggie led the way, the buckboard's lamps cutting a feeble path through the swirling dust and light drizzle. The descent into the riverbed was steep, the ground loose and unstable. Just as the first third of the herd was scrambling across the deeply cracked clay of the river bottom, a bolt of lightning split the sky. It was followed almost instantly by a deafening clap of thunder. Then, the heavy rain they had feared descended, not the anticipated monsoon, but a devastating, localized burst from the canyon far above. "Flash flood," Wyatt screamed over the noise, his voice barely audible. The sound of the coming water, a low, terrifying roar, like an army marching over gravel, was already beginning to echo off the canyon walls. They were trapped at the bottom of the dried river, and the flood was coming far earlier than any prediction. The climax of their struggle against nature, and against Crane, had just begun. The flash flood arrived not as a slow rise, but as a violent, churning wave of red mud and debris, a horrifying roar that sounded like the Mogollon Rim itself was being torn in half. Lightning split the bruised sky with surgical precision, momentarily illuminating the chaos in the dry riverbed. The combination of the immediate danger, the deafening thunder, and the sight of the approaching water was enough to trigger a devastating stampede. The herd, already skittish from the midnight move, went instantly mad. A stampede is not merely a run. It is a force of blind, irrational terror, and the cattle plunged toward the low, open ground, directly into the path of the rising torrent. The air was instantly thick with the smell of wet hide, fear, and pulverized sand. Wyatt, mounted on his powerful blue roan, was already in motion. His movements were born of instinct, honed by years of surviving the land's sudden treachery. He knew the herd had to be turned to keep them from hitting the main rush of water, and to prevent them from simply scattering into the high, broken country where they would be lost forever. He rode his horse with reckless abandon, cutting diagonally across the panicked flanks of the herd. He snatched his oilskin coat from his saddle and began whipping it above his head like a frenzied sail, using the massive, flaring fabric to create a noise and motion barrier. He was a lone figure against a wave of thousands of pounds of frantic animal muscle, the sound of his efforts swallowed by the storm. Maggie was perched precariously on the high bank of the riverbed, having already secured the buckboard. She realized that Wyatt's effort was not enough to counter the stampede's momentum. She scrambled to her medical kit, not for bandages, but for the small box of signal fireworks she kept for emergency signaling. She ignited the first fuse and fired the small, sputtering rocket high into the churning air. It exploded in a sharp, glittering burst of orange and green light. She fired another, and another, carefully placing the explosions in a broad, semicircular pattern at the herd's head, just beyond Wyatt's reach. The sharp, unnatural pops, combined with the sudden color, provided the necessary shock. The led cows, momentarily confused and blinded, faltered and began to swing away from the most explosive point. Meanwhile, young June, clinging to the edge of the bank, realized the ranch hands scattered across the field couldn't hear Wyatt's shouted commands over the downpour. She pulled the small tin whistle she kept around her neck, the one she usually used for calling the chickens, and blew into it with all her youthful might. The high, thin, piercing shriek of the tin whistle cut through the low frequencies of the thunder and the herd's bellowing, a sound recognizable to the hands as a frantic call to action. It worked. Thomas and Jesse, hearing the distinctive sound, instantly turned their horses and rode to reinforce Wyatt's efforts. The herd began to turn, but the wave of mud and water was upon them. The first dark torrent, thick with silt and debris, slammed into the lower edge of the riverbed. Suddenly, Thomas, the youngest and greenest of the hands, was unseated. His horse reared violently as a floating log struck its leg. Thomas went down hard into the sucking, sandy mud, the panicked herd threatening to trample him instantly. Maggie, without thinking, slid down the muddy bank. The risk was enormous, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest piece of rope, the end of a stray lariat, and scrambled toward the fallen hand. The wet, running cattle made the ground treacherous. She reached Thomas, whose leg was trapped, and began furiously digging him out of the slurry. "I got you! Thomas, hold still!" she yelled. Just as she pulled his leg free, a stray, heavy bridle line, attached to a passing, wild-eyed steer, whipped through the air. It struck Maggie's right forearm with the force of a coiled snake, the rough leather strap tearing a long, deep gash through the layers of her coat and into her skin. She barely registered the sharp, cold pain, only the burst of warm blood that instantly mingled with the cold mud. She pulled Thomas up, pushing him toward the bank where Jesse grabbed him. Maggie turned back to the herd, seeing Wyatt struggling to anchor the turn, his horse straining. The riverbed was now a rushing stream. Wyatt saw the led cows were still dangerously close to the main torrent. Knowing he couldn't hold the entire momentum of the stampede with mere horsemanship, he made a calculated, desperate move. He steered his blue roan toward a massive, deep-rooted mesquite tree that had stood sentinel on the high side of the riverbed for a century. With a swift movement, he detached a sturdy, heavy length of his own lariat from his saddle, wrapped it 3 times around the trunk, and then cinched the other end around his waist. He dug his spurs in, urging his horse forward, using himself and the rooted tree as a living anchor to block the path of the nearest cattle. He was holding the line. A man attempting to stop an avalanche. The rope bit savagely into his torso, and the strain was immense. But it held. The sudden, unmoving obstacle of Wyatt and his horse backed by the ancient mesquite forced the main body of the herd to finally pivot away from the flood path. Maggie, bleeding freely but ignoring the pain, climbed back up the bank. She saw Wyatt straining, his face contorted with effort, holding the weight of the ranch's survival on a thin piece of rope anchored to his body. She ran toward him, shouting over the storm, "Let go, you'll break a rib." "I won't let them scatter," Wyatt yelled back, his voice ragged. Maggie grabbed the nearest part of the rope and pressed herself against him, adding her small weight to the anchor. She looked up at him, the rain washing the mud from her face. "Don't let me fall," she pleaded, her voice cracking from the shock and the effort. Wyatt looked down at her, rain streaming off the brim of his hat, his face a grim study in focus and survival. His eyes, however, held a flicker of that profound sincerity she had seen beneath the stable roof. "If you fall," he stated, his jaw locked against the strain, "you fall into my hands." The commitment was absolute. It was a promise made not in sunshine and comfort, but in the raw, brutal reality of survival. He was physically tethered, holding their joint future safe. Slowly, agonizingly, the last of the herd was forced up the opposite bank, safely away from the flash flood's path. The danger was over, the cattle were safe. Wyatt cut the rope from his waist, falling back against the tree, breathing heavily. The thunder was receding, replaced by the relentless, soaking patter of a more general rain. The herd was saved. But the cost was immediate. As the light of the early, bruised dawn broke through the clouds, Maggie saw at the northern embankment of the ranch's largest storage cistern had collapsed under the sheer weight of the sudden, localized deluge. The emergency water reserve, the precious cache of water they had been hoarding for the dry season, was gone, sucked back into the greedy, muddy earth. The symbolic weight of the moment was heavy. The control that the lariat and the mesquite tree had given Wyatt in the chaos was only temporary. The lightning of their past problems, the fraudulent telegram, Crane's greed. The memory of Daniel's death had struck the present, destroying their resources even as they saved the cattle. The tension eased in their external struggle, but transferred immediately to their physical and emotional states. Maggie staggered toward the buckboard, her arm throbbing fiercely, the bright, fresh blood soaking the remnants of her sleeve. Wyatt reached her first. He saw the dark, deep gash, the raw white edges of the wound against the mud and blood. The shock was setting in. Maggie's breath was shallow, ragged, and her whole body began to tremble violently from the cold, the fear, and the pain. Wyatt did not ask. He simply gathered her into his arms. Lifting her against his chest, he held her tight, his own body heavy with exhaustion, his warmth immediately attempting to counteract the chill of her trauma. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, only the deep, natural intimacy of shared survival. Her small, trembling frame felt fragile against his solid strength. He didn't speak of love or commitment. He spoke only of the physical need of the moment. "You're safe," he murmured into her wet hair. "Just breathe. We're safe." He carried her to the buckboard, his gaze never leaving her face. The physical contact, raw and immediate after the brush with death, established a profound connection that transcended any previous boundary. But their relief was brief. As the cold, gray morning fully dawned, they could see the ranch headquarters from the riverbed. A plume of thick, acrid black smoke was coiling lazily into the sky from the direction of the main barns. The hay storage, their feed supply for the coming winter, was on fire. Crane's men had not bothered with the cattle. They had gone for the essential resources instead. The climax had shifted from a battle against nature to a battle against human malice. The black smoke coiling against the bruised morning sky was the color of malice. When Wyatt and Maggie reached the smoking ruins of the hay storage barn, the truth was immediately apparent. The fire was no accident. The heavy, unmistakable odor of kerosene hung sickly in the damp air, marking the deliberate intent of the arson. Near the foundation, Maggie found a scorched, partially melted oil can that had been hastily discarded. It bore the logo of Crane and Associates. Wyatt's face was a study in cold, contained fury. He moved with Maggie to quickly examine the perimeter, finding the tracks of 3 men and tucked carelessly beneath a juniper bush, a heavy leather glove belonging to one of Crane's known henchmen. The evidence was thin but clear. This was not rustling. This was war, escalating from theft to intentional destruction. Despite her throbbing, hastily bandaged arm, Maggie wasted no time. They drove the buckboard straight into Saguaro Bend, carrying the tangible evidence of Crane's crimes. The sheriff's office was quiet. Ebb Miles, looking older and more tired than ever, sat behind his desk. Wyatt laid the pieces of evidence on the worn wood, the discarded oil can, the henchman's glove, the false telegram signed with the fraudulent Wyatt Cole signature, and the first, original, forged wire bearing Maggie's initial, M. Hart. "We have the cowards who did this. Ebb," Wyatt stated, his voice low and steady. "And we have proof they've been using the telegraph office to destroy my reputation and steal my herd." Ebb Miles sank lower in his chair, running a shaky hand over his face. He looked out the window toward the silver spur, then back at Wyatt. "I know, Wyatt, I know Crane is rotten, but he has my boy. The debt is too large. If I move against Crane, Harlan will take my son's claim and he'll run out of the territory." Maggie stepped forward, her quiet authority filling the room. "Sheriff, you made a choice last night when you warned Wyatt. Now you make the full choice. We have direct witness testimony. Thomas and June can swear to the fire. We have the physical evidence of the oil. And the telegrams prove a conspiracy." Miles hesitated. fear and duty battling on his face. Finally, with a heavy, defeated sigh, he reached for his pistol and slammed it on the desk. I can't move against Crane directly. Not yet, but I can bring in that glove-wearing fool. It's enough to send a message. He sent his deputy out with an immediate arrest warrant for the henchman. The legal battle escalated immediately. Crane's countermove was swift and devastating. Banker Harlan, acting on the forged telegram supposedly authorizing the sale of the herd, issued a public notice of foreclosure and announced an emergency public auction. The Cole Ranch assets, including the remaining herd and the land itself, would be put up for sale to cover the debt. The auction was set for high noon in the town square. The news ripped through Saguaro Bend, polarizing the community. Half the town, frightened of Harlan and indebted to Crane, looked away, murmuring about Wyatt's bad luck and Maggie's troublesome reputation. The other half, the homesteaders and the few remaining honest ranchers, saw the transparent attempt to steal the land. Maggie knew that legal brute force had to be met with meticulous intelligence. She took the original forged M. Hart telegram and the subsequent forged Wyatt Cole wire to the post office and telegraph office. She examined the ink stains on the paper, the specific shade of the blue ink, and the slight smudge pattern unique to the Santa Fe station's stamps. She also analyzed the handwriting, that painfully familiar hand of her former betrayer. She found a minute, almost invisible detail: the forger consistently misspelled the word delivered, using tools instead of one. A characteristic spelling error her old lover had made in every letter he'd ever written her. The forger is the same person. Wyatt, Maggie explained, showing him the meticulous proof in the ledger. And the forger is the same man who scammed me in Kansas. He's here, working for Crane, running these wires. He's using my bad past to create your bad future. She then pointed to the ink. This blue ink, this exact hue, is chemically different from the standard ink used here. I believe it's a specialty ink only available in the Santa Fe main office, indicating that the documents are not local, but are being carefully manipulated from the large distribution center. She marched to the nearest honest merchant, the man who ran the general store and despised Crane, and drafted a new, urgent telegram. This time, she wasn't sending a message. She was requesting a confirmation of forgery directly from a contact in the Santa Fe bureau. As the townspeople gathered in the square for the auction, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Crane, standing next to Harlan, looked supremely confident, his hands clasped behind his back. He intended to be the only bidder and buy the entire Cole herd for pennies. Maggie faced Harlan directly, her eyes unwavering. Harlan, a small, nervous man, sweated slightly under the heat. Mr. Harlan, my name is worth the paper you're using to condemn it, she challenged, holding up the ledger showing the Cole Ranch's solvent books. Did you even verify the signature on that wire, or did you just take Crane's word because he controls your debt? Harlan stammered, pointing at the forged signature. The signature is valid, and even if it weren't, Miss Hart, your own name is tied to the first instance of fraud. This whole ranch is compromised. My name is cheap currency. Is that what you mean? Maggie asked, her voice calm but penetrating the growing crowd. Harlan, emboldened by Crane's presence, puffed out his chest. In a bank, any signature is cheap if there's no one strong enough to hold it. Wyatt stepped up, moving so close to Maggie that his broad shoulders shielded her completely from the crowd. He looked Harlan in the eye, then settled his gaze on Maggie. I hold it, Wyatt declared, his voice cutting through the rising noise. I hold her name, and I hold the ranch, and I'm not selling. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a rider from the post office, waving a piece of paper. Maggie's urgent request had paid off. The new, verified telegram from a legitimate Santa Fe public servant confirmed that the postmark on the Mupperture Hart wire was officially declared a forgery, and the characteristic chemical properties of the ink suggested widespread fraud from a single source. The chain of evidence was complete. The fire, the glove, the testimony of Thomas and June, the fraudulent signature, and now, the official confirmation of the fake postmark. Ebb Miles had all the legal cause he needed. The community, seeing the official proof, began to murmur louder, their fear giving way to righteous anger. The tension broke into a showdown, but not with bullets, with cash. Crane, realizing his legal play was crumbling, tried to muscle his way through the auction. He started the bidding, offering a ridiculously low price for the first section of the herd, intending to seize the majority of the assets. But Maggie and June had spent the morning talking to the homesteaders and the church leaders. Maggie showed them the meticulous Cole Ranch books, demonstrating that if Crane bought the herd cheap, it would crash the market for everyone. The local pastor, seeing Maggie's commitment to teaching the children, publicly endorsed the rancher. As Crane made his first bid, a wave of small ranchers and merchants, pooling their meager resources, began to outbid him in tiny, persistent increments. They didn't have enough to buy the whole herd, but they bought it in small lots, driven by the quiet hope of restoring the assets to Wyatt after the auction was over. It was a community counterpunch, slow and deliberate, a testament to the belief Maggie and Wyatt had instilled in the working people. Crane was apoplectic. He realized he was losing the asset and, worse, losing the moral high ground in public. "You cheating dirt farmers," he roared, dropping his pretense of civility. He lunged toward Harlan, attempting to seize the documents, but Wyatt intercepted him, his movements quicker than the eye could follow. Crane, desperate and cornered, saw his empire crumbling. He drew a small, silver-plated pistol from his waistcoat. "This land is mine!" Crane shrieked, aiming wildly. Sheriff Ebb Miles, who had been watching the scene with mounting resignation, finally made his choice. Before Crane could fire, Miles drew his own weapon and fired one clean, sharp shot. It wasn't aimed at the heart, but at the arm. The pistol clattered harmlessly to the ground as Crane screamed, clutching his wounded limb. The clatter of the handcuffs closing around Crane's wrist was the final, definitive sound of the climax. Law had been served, not by a single hero, but by a combination of community trust, forensic bookkeeping, and one man's quiet courage. The auction was immediately suspended. Wyatt had lost his water and his hay, but he had saved his herd and his land. The smoke cleared slowly over Cole Ranch, a lingering reminder of the fire and the flash flood. The hay barn was gone, reduced to charred beams and a mound of damp ash. The northern embankment of the cistern remained a jagged, gaping hole. They had saved the herd, but the ranch was materially broken. The consequence of their ordeal, however, was a deep, quiet healing. The community stepped up. The ranchers who had pooled their money to counter Crane's bid returned the small lots of cattle to Wyatt, now officially cleared of debt thanks to the timely intervention of Sheriff Miles. Moreover, they arrived in force with tools and draft horses. Wyatt, Maggie, and the ranch hands worked alongside their neighbors to rebuild the essential infrastructure. The men brought rock and clay to shore up the northern bank of the cistern. Wyatt and Maggie worked side by side to construct a new, smaller storage shed made of resilient juniper wood, utilizing every scrap of salvageable material. They moved with a seamless efficiency. Their earlier restraint vanished. Wyatt would split the tough, fragrant wood with powerful, rhythmic strokes, and Maggie would follow, her injured arm still wrapped tightly, carefully measuring the joints and sinking the nails with deliberate precision. This shared physical labor, building a future out of the dust, was more intimate than any conversation. Maggie's name was publicly cleared. The newly arrested henchman, under pressure, confessed to working with Maggie's old lover, the cipher, to forge the wires. The post office officially published a notice confirming the forgery of the Santa Fe stamp. Banker Harlan, now facing scrutiny over his suspicious lending practices, was immediately placed under investigation by the territorial authorities. The change in their relationship was marked by a quiet reversal of roles. Wyatt, a man who had always taken the burden silently, began to vocalize his needs. He learned to ask Maggie to check the tension on a new fence line, or to advise him on the purchase of feed, rather than assuming he had to know everything. He was learning the necessity of partnership. Maggie, conversely, learned to accept help without feeling diminished. When her right arm became too swollen to effectively stir the large pot of stew, she let Wyatt take over, leaning against the counter and simply watching him work, accepting his service without protest. She learned that accepting support wasn't weakness, but an acknowledgement of shared humanity. Their symbols reflected this hard-won persistence. The kerosene lamp in Maggie's room was replaced with a new glass chimney, the light steady and clear now. The original, dented tin cup that Wyatt had given her was still used daily, but now it was a badge of honor scratched, dinged, but always full of hot coffee. It represented the simple, durable nature of their connection. June's transformation was the most heartwarming. The ranch celebrated its survival with a service at the wooden church. June, clean and nervous, stood before the congregation. Using the large, heavy pages from Maggie's old account ledger, she read a passage from the Bible, her voice clear and strong. Maggie watched from the back row, a profound sense of peace settling over her. June, standing there with her head held high, represented the hope Maggie had been denied in her own youth, the chance to stand firm, educated and respected, free from old debts. The shift was even reflected in their quiet, shared humor. Wyatt, remembering Maggie's first attempt at baking, decided to try his hand at cooking. He attempted cornbread. It emerged from the oven black, smoking, and utterly inedible. He placed the charred brick on the table with a theatrical groan. "I told you I'd break a man's heart. Maggie, I can't even bake bread without ruining it." Maggie, nursing a cup of coffee, reached across the table, broke off a small, hardened piece of the black crust, and chewed it slowly. She squinted at him, a genuine smile playing on her lips. "Don't complain, Wyatt," she said, her tone light and teasing, echoing his words from weeks before. "That's your smell of home." Wyatt laughed, a deep, easy sound of genuine joy, and Maggie felt her own heart relax further. In the public realm, Saguaro Bend was undergoing a cleansing. Sheriff Ebb Miles, though exonerated for his part in catching Crane, publicly resigned. He admitted that his moral compromises, driven by fear for his son, had made him unworthy of wearing the badge. It was an act of profound, public humility. He then opened a small blacksmith shop on the edge of town, starting over by working with his hands. The new sheriff, surprisingly, was a capable widow named Penelope Vance, a woman known for her courage and sharp intellect, a clear message that justice and authority in the territory would no longer be limited by gender. As the ranch recovered, Wyatt began to spend his evenings working on a small, unused cabin on the eastern edge of the property, far from the main house. It was structurally sound, but had long been used for storage. He was meticulously restoring it, shoring up the foundations, replacing the roofing shingles, and adding a small, sturdy porch. The hands assumed it was meant for the new foreman he would hire come spring. Wyatt let them assume. The work and the reason for the work remained his secret. The narrative rhythm slowed, becoming gentle and focused on the intimate details of recovery. The scent of pine and fresh soil replaced the smell of dust and burnt hay. Late one cold, star-dusted night, Wyatt and Maggie were sitting on the porch of the main house. The desert air crisp and silent. Maggie's arm was healing, and the only sound was the distant call of an owl. "We made it through the fire, the flood, and Crane," Maggie said softly. "The water reserve is gone, but the ground is wet. We'll survive the next dry season." Wyatt leaned back, his profile shadowed against the vast expanse of the night sky. "We will. The water will come back. The rains always return." He paused, then turned his head, his voice sinking to a lower, more serious register. "It's going to be a long winter, Maggie, but a good one. After a long drought, the monsoon is the only real promise a man can believe in." He was not talking about the weather. He was talking about the future, about the marriage and the home he had always wanted to build, the eventual return of warmth and life after the long, dry period of their separate struggles. The conversation was an unspoken covenant, a quiet acknowledgement of the relationship that had become stronger than the hardships they had faced. The stage was set for the final decision. The quiet peace that followed Crane's arrest and the ranch's physical recovery was deceptive. It was the calm before an entirely internal storm. The storm arrived not as a telegram of fraud, but as an official, dignified letter delivered by the newly appointed Sheriff Vance. The letter bore a genuine seal from a reputable maternity hospital and medical complex in Wichita, Kansas. Maggie opened it with a curious dread in her room above the shed. It was an offer of employment, not as a seasonal helper, but as a permanent, salaried nurse and doctor assistant at the women's infirmary. It offered stability, a pension plan, and a life far removed from the dirt, risk, and constant battle of the frontier. It was her old, quiet dream of safety made suddenly, tangibly real, a chance to finally leave the borderlands and live peacefully. Maggie sat on the edge of her small bed, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. The date the hospital needed her by was fast approaching the end of the month. She had achieved her goal, she had the means, the reputation, and now the opportunity to escape. But looking out her small window, she didn't see the Kansas plains. She saw the sturdy juniper shed they had just built, the clean, deep blue of the sky after the rain, and the faint figure of Wyatt Cole checking the new support beams of the repaired cistern. She saw June running across the yard, clutching a book, and the patient, loyal forms of the Cole Ranch cattle. She was torn between the stability of the known world, a place where she was professionally needed, and the strange, fierce, emotional home she had accidentally built here. The internal conflict was agonizing. If she left, she guaranteed her own security, fulfilling the core need that had driven her across half the country. If she stayed, she risked everything on a man whose deepest fear was betrayal, and a piece of land that demanded continuous, grueling sacrifice. And there was the persistent fear, her conviction that she was hard to love. Would Wyatt, who tamed wild horses, eventually grow weary of trying to tame her guarded heart? Would her difficulty inevitably bring him pain? She carried the letter with her all day, its official stiffness a harsh contrast to the easy rhythm of ranch life. Wyatt sensed the distance immediately. He found her just before dawn the next day, standing by the cook fire, staring into the flickering embers. He didn't ask about the letter, he asked about the fire. "We need more juniper for the cook fire," he observed, stirring the coffee in the large tin pot. "This cedar burns too fast." "What is it?" Maggie hesitated, then slowly extended the folded, official letter. Wyatt took it, unfolded it, and read it in the pale, growing light of the morning. His expression remained neutral, but the hand holding the paper clenched slightly. He folded the letter and handed it back, his gaze fixed on the low mountains. "It's a good offer. A clean life. No rustlers. No floods. A good wage." "It's the life I came out here to find the money for," Maggie confessed, her voice strained. "A chance to stop running." "Are you still running?" he asked, turning to face her fully. This was the core of her internal struggle. She looked at him, seeing not the confident rancher, but the man who had anchored himself against a flood to save his herd. Wyatt, knowing he could no longer afford silence, spoke the truth he had learned over months of shared adversity. He didn't try to appeal to grand love or passion. He spoke the language of necessity and earned commitment. "I won't tell you to stay, Maggie. I won't rope you with a promise. I won't hold you here with the debt of my gratitude," he said, his voice stripped bare of all pretense. "But I can tell you the truth I've learned since you came here. I need you. The ranch hands need you. You're the reason Tomas can still walk without a limp. June and those other children need you to teach them how to read the world. This land, this place, needs you. You bring order and honest work where there was only chaos and lies." He had finally learned to articulate his needs, not as demands, but as simple, undeniable facts. He needed her because she completed the equation of his life, providing the intellectual and emotional resilience he lacked. "You're talking about work." "Wyatt," Maggie whispered, fighting back tears. "I'm talking about living here. Forever. I'm talking about being yours. And I told you, I'm hard to love. I'm difficult. I don't give easy. Wyatt reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of leather, a brand new, beautifully braided bridle rein he had been working on in secret. It was dyed a deep, honest brown and was soft and pliable. At the end, he had tied a complex, permanent knot, one that required skill and patience to secure. Known as the double bind hitch, a knot used to ensure two separate ropes pull equally against a common load. He held the rein out to her as the sun began to crest the rim, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and gold. I don't have a gold ring, he said, his voice steady, only strong. Good leather. This knot means both sides hold the weight. It doesn't break under strain. It's durable. No fine words, just durability. Maggie Hart, stay here. We'll tie our lives together with a strong cord. Will you bind yourself to me? It was the most honest proposal she could have ever received, a non-negotiable contract of shared labor and mutual respect, symbolized by a tool of the ranch. Maggie took the braided rein, her fingers tracing the complex, beautiful double knot. The years of fear, running, and self-doubt fell away. She looked at the man who had chosen to trust her when the world called her a fraud. I will stay, Maggie said, her voice light and certain, the strongest promise she had ever made. She gave him a small, genuine smile. But I'm warning you again. Wyatt Cole. I'll still be difficult on the days the dust blows worst. I'll still be hard to love. Wyatt reached out, took the braided rein from her hand, and tied it to the post on the porch, a visible, permanent marker. Then we'll just build the walls a little higher, he replied, his eyes shining with relief and humor. And we'll put up extra fence posts. He closed the distance between them, and this time the kiss was not tentative or brief. It was deep, consuming, and honest. The silent acknowledgement of all the tension, shared danger, and respect they had built over the season. It was still restrained, clean of unnecessary dramatics, but filled with the profound, rough emotional force of two solitary people finding necessary shelter in each other. In the background, the low, distant lowing of the herd provided a familiar, earthy soundtrack. The West never went completely silent, a reminder that their life would always be a struggle, but it would be a shared one. The commitment did not remain private for long. Word spread like wildfire through the ranch. June, ecstatic, ran out and returned with her arms full of bright yellow and purple desert wildflowers, strewing them haphazardly on the ground near the porch. The ranch hands, including Tomas and Jesse, gathered, shouting their congratulations. The celebration was simple, marked by hearty handshakes and backslaps. Later that afternoon, Maggie and Wyatt drove into Saguaro Bend one last time before the wedding, scheduled for the end of the week. Wyatt insisted they register their intentions officially. The ceremony was simple. The new Sheriff Vance, efficient and solemn, signed the civil commitment papers, the witness section filled by two nearby, grinning ranch hands, the community, seeing the genuine, hard-earned happiness of the pair, offered genuine congratulations. As they left the office, Thomas, Jesse, and June were waiting by the buckboard. Don't burn the cornbread this time, Maggie Thomas shouted with a laugh, his face beaming. Maggie only winked, looking at Wyatt, then back at Tomas. It's fine. Tomas, che la moina. Remember, it's his kind of home now? The laughter that erupted from the ranch hands was loud, rich, and full of shared understanding. That evening, back in her room, Maggie retrieved the official Kansas letter. She folded it neatly, smoothing the crisp paper with her fingers. She walked over to the small bookshelf, opened the King James Bible that had traveled with her through the territory, and placed the letter inside, marking the passage from the Book of Ruth about not being asked to return. She was not burning the past. She was simply settling it in a safe place. She was choosing a new narrative, a new life not of safety and escape, but of durable, hard-won belonging. The future, symbolized by the braided reins now tied to the sturdy porch post, was no longer a dream of running, but a promise of staying. The small cabin on the eastern ridge of Cole Ranch, the one Wyatt had been secretly restoring, became their first home. It wasn't grand. It was simple, sturdy, and smelled of new juniper wood and honest sweat. The marriage was not just between Wyatt and Maggie, but between them and the rough and demanding land. The household quickly settled into a family by choice: Wyatt, Maggie, and June, along with the two loyal ranch hands. Thomas and Jesse formed the bedrock of their collective existence. June stopped being a shy ranch hand's daughter and became the ranch's junior scholar, her small frame bustling with importance. The classes under the towering saguaro became a daily, ingrained ritual, and Maggie, teaching the children to form letters in the dust, felt a profound fulfillment that superseded any professional title in Kansas. The long shadow of Silas Crane finally faded. He was transported to Tucson for trial, where the weight of the evidence, the recovered documents, the confessions of his henchmen, and the forensic work done by Maggie assured his conviction. Banker Harlan faced a crippling internal audit, and the loans he had fraudulently called in were reversed, restoring the dignity and assets of several small homesteaders. Ebb Miles, the former sheriff, found peace in the honest labor of his new life. His bellows hissed contentedly at his small blacksmith forge in Saguaro Bend, hammering out horseshoes instead of compromising his conscience. It was a humane resolution, proving that the frontier code did not always have to end in violence. Sometimes it ended in quiet, necessary reconstruction. The ranch itself embodied a stubborn, durable survival. The new rock and clay retaining wall held firm during the next minor deluge, a testament to learned respect for the land. Wyatt installed a network of simple gutters and barrels around the outbuildings, transforming the occasional, localized rainfall into a precious, conserved resource. The cattle, well-fed and safely managed, produced a healthy, thriving crop of calves the following spring. They had learned to live with the land, adapting to its treachery, rather than attempting to conquer its vastness. The core theme of their story crystallized in the daily routine. Love, they discovered, was not a sudden, magical cure for their fears. It was patient labor. It was in the act of retying a knot that had come loose, in the precise act of replacing a flickering lamp wick, and in the simple, necessary gesture of dividing a fresh loaf of cornbread. Wyatt's boast that he would tame wild things proved to be true, not because he changed Maggie, but because he gave her the security to shed her own armor. His work to tame the wild was primarily the work of confronting his own fear of loss and learning to place his entire belief in another person. Maggie, in turn, allowed herself to be chosen and, more importantly, chose to stay. The symbols of their journey were gathered in their new cabin. The braided double-bind rein, the one Wyatt had used to propose, was now hung proudly on a juniper wood peg near the door. The kerosene lamp, now steady and bright, stood on the desk, no longer sputtering in the wind. The original tin cup, now even more dented and scarred, was their favorite for morning coffee, beautiful because it had endured. Their humor, the quiet scaffolding of their relationship, remained their strongest defense. One evening, watching Maggie mend a shirt, Wyatt posed the question that had once dominated their fearful thoughts. If I wake up one morning, and the dust is high, and you're feeling difficult again, my wild thing, if you're hard to love that day, what then? Maggie didn't look up from her stitching. Then you start over. You practice taming me again, Wyatt, just like you practice baking my cornbread. It'll probably burn a time or two. Their laughter was soft, comfortable, and warm in the small cabin. The final, unexpected gift of hope arrived on a cold, windless night. A young wife of one of the homesteaders, a woman named Faith, went into difficult labor. Wyatt brought Maggie to the small, wooden house immediately. In the dim light of a smoky lantern, Maggie, relying on her years of practice and calm competence, worked through the night. As the eastern sky began to pale, the sound that rang out in the Arizona night was the thin, perfect demanding cry of a newborn baby. It was the first child born in Saguaro Bend since the chaos of Crane's reign had ended, a raw, undeniable signal of a new start. Maggie stepped out of the small cabin and into the cool dawn. Her face smeared with exhaustion, but alight with purpose. She had been chosen by this community, and she had chosen to serve it. Wyatt met her gaze, a profound understanding passing between them. June, who had been sleeping in the buckboard, was now awake, tracing words in her notebook. She looked up at Maggie, then down at her work. The essay she was writing, assigned by Maggie, bore the clear title, "Home is Where One Chooses to Remain." Wyatt led Maggie back toward their home, the air now fragrant with the promise of a sunny day, the smell of clean mud and the dry sweetness of the horse pasture. They moved in silence, a long, deep breath taken after a long journey. On the small porch of their juniper cabin, they sat close, shoulders touching. They looked out over the sprawling, demanding, beautiful desert, waiting for the full force of the sun to break. They did not speak of the future's challenges, only of the coming warmth. "Look at the sky, Maggie," Wyatt murmured, his voice gentle. "It's clear. The monsoon is still coming." Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder. "It always does." They sat together, two people who had endured their separate droughts, now tethered by enduring strength, looking toward an open, bright horizon. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.